Welcome to Press This, the WordPress Community Podcast featuring exclusive content and interviews with leaders in the WordPress community, covering everything from development to integrating your digital marketing strategy with WordPress. Join host David Vogelpohl of WP Engine and special guests from across the community as they keep you up to speed on the latest advancements in WordPress. Let's get started.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Press This, the WordPress Community Podcast on WMR. This is your host, David Vogelpohl. I support the WordPress community through my role at WP Engine, and I love to bring the best of the community to you here every week on Press This. As a reminder, you can follow me on Twitter at WPDavidV. You can subscribe to Press This on iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or download the latest episodes at WMR.fm. In this episode, we're going to be talking about breaking your WordPress site to make it better. And joining us for that conversation from Warr Research, I'd like to welcome to Press This, Mr. Jacob Warr. Jacob, welcome.
Well, thank you for having me, David. I truly appreciate it. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, it's a fun topic. I really love breaking websites. It's a passion of mine, actually. And I really want to unpack with you, though, what you mean by that. And for those listening, of course, it's really around the notion of safely deconstructing the sites you manage to reform them into something stronger and better at driving growth, which I think is pretty cool. And I know that's one of my first stops when I'm optimizing to site. It's to see how much I can break and does that really matter and how might I build it back better. So Jacob, to kick us off, I'm going to ask you the same question I ask all our guests. Can you briefly tell me your WordPress origin story?
Yes. And so it took me a little bit it takes me a little bit to think about that, because I actually, the first time I touched WordPress was probably shortly after around 2006, believe it or not. So I go way back. I didn't get into the development side of it until a few years later, but the first time I truly experienced WordPress was back then. So been with it for a while now.
What did you do in 2006? What was your first activity with WordPress?
Creating a basic blog. Honestly, it was one of those that I had developed my first web page, not site, page, all the way back in high school. And so I got fascinated with it and continued on and started doing some small projects here and there, because my career actually started in the IT world. And I had a side passion with web development that turned into more and more of a core passion from then on. So I was always looking at things like Joomla, Drupal, and things like that back then. And then I got turned on to WordPress, I think, through a Linux forum I was reading back then on building websites and stuff, and heard about WordPress. And then around 2006, started with just kind of a tinker project.
Oh, that's really cool. I think you're the first guest we have who learned about WordPress in a Linux forum. So that's a first for you there, Jacob. But that's pretty cool. So 2006, this would have been right after themes and plugins were introduced, but before widgets and shortcodes. So kind of an interesting time to get in. I think I maybe can see why you even maybe waited a while before you started building in it, maybe in addition to your personal journey there. I was wondering if you could also tell me a little bit about Warr Research. You kind of mentioned your roots in IT, but obviously have kind of grown into WordPress and web development since then. But what does Warr Research do?
Warr Research at its core, we're a technology and digital marketing company. And what that is so I have a career over the last 23 years in both IT and web and digital marketing. And so I started this company actually in 2019. And based on a career of both freelance and working for anywhere from federal contracting to working for mom and pops over my career, and started the company to basically help people get the most out of current technology resources in order so in order for them to continue to grow their business and continue to build something they are passionate about. I had an opportunity to branch off on my own again and started Warren's research with that core focus of just simply how can I help people go after their passions and goals in the business world.
I like it. I like it. I love objective-based optimization. That's always the best part. Okay, so it sounds like you've had some experience working on and optimizing lots and lots of different websites, different kinds of websites even, it sounded like. So I'm guessing you've had the opportunity to break a lot of sites. The notion of like breaking your site, of course, is a little bit counterintuitive. But can you tell us what you mean by that when you think of like, quote, breaking a site on a new customer or project? What do you think about when you say that?
The best way to summarize it is discovery. You can only figure out what's completely wrong with a site by truly being willing to throw caution to the wind and dive into it. Now, there is one of those great asterisks with that is if the site is not performing well, if a site is not achieving what it's intended to, that's when you should truly consider breaking the site within the confines of a staging or development environment. Cowboy development on it is not, I don't recommend it. And it is something that you need to make sure that you're definitely not a junior level developer doing it if you need to do that. There's the disclaimer with it. But the reality is WordPress is a framework. It allows you, it has a lot of power and a lot of potential. And that's where we look into those plugins and other related modules and APIs that you can work with in it. So when I think about breaking the site, you have to be willing to not assume that anything works correctly.
So fundamentally, though, I mean, obviously, I love the staging disclaimer. I probably should have had that at the very beginning of the episode here, but yeah, obviously, break your site and staging first. But like you kind of framed it in this notion of discovery, and then you kind of talked about diving in, I guess, to breaking it. And by breaking it, do you mean like changing the functionality, turning off plugins? Like, help me understand what like an act of breaking might mean.
An act of breaking is, okay. So when you create a website, you should have a goal, a mission, something that the site has a certain purpose for. You need to be able, especially how the landscape has changed, how performance requirements as far as page speed and all that needs to be addressed. You need to find out where are the lagging points within your site. And if you are one of those that just layer upon layer different plugins, there are a lot of plugins that are well intended. They're not coded perfectly, which is awesome because it gives you the ability to do what you want the site to do. But you need to have the mindset that the purpose of the site is the user experience matched with the objectives of that site, whether it's a business site, a site for a nonprofit. What are you trying to achieve? Is your site effectively achieving that in the most efficient way possible? And that's it.
So it sounds like you're thinking about like plugins in particular, it sounded like in your example, but there are jobs that the plugins are doing. Collectively, the mission of the site and the plugins and theme or whatever is being used to facilitate it is to achieve some kind of objective. And so you're not breaking that, but you're maybe breaking all the other, or not all of them, but like other pieces of the puzzle, presumably to see if they're materially contributing to the mission of the site, And I guess in exchange for the cost and performance or whatever else the plugin introduces into the system. From the high level, would you say that's fair?
From the high level, I'd say that's definitely mostly fair. It's one of those that to break something for the sake of breaking, that's not what I'm speaking into. To break something to learn how to do it better, if the intention is to build something better, that's at the high level, I say, where the idea and the passion of breaking a site is.
I love it. I love it. I love it. Okay. So great. We talked about kind of the philosophy of breaking a site, and thank you for that. I want to dive into more of this particulars and then the strategies to use there. But we're going to take our first break, and we'll be right back.
Time to plug into a commercial break. Stay tuned for more Press This in just a moment.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Press This, the WordPress Community Podcast on WMR. This is your host, David Vogelpohl. I'm interviewing Jacob Warr about breaking your WordPress site to make it better. Jacob, right before the break, you were sharing a little bit around your views about what breaking your site means in your view. Earlier, though, you gave the kind of disclaimer about not breaking your site in production. I wanted to kind of get a little bit more particular for this part of the interview. How do you manage things like local dev and staging environments? Like, do you have any specific recommendations, or just generally, what is your approach there?
My approach is at times somewhat chaotic. So I'm one of those that up until my adult years, meaning just within the last few years, I had ADHD challenges. So a lot of my development process was all over the board until recent. But it's one of those where to match with client objectives, definitely throw everything on the development cycle. Before you start diving into anybody's site, is to be with a hosting provider, or there's all sorts of different applications and software suites that you can do to bring an environment where you can spin it up locally for staging. And staging meaning that you have an area where you can test and destroy and quickly revert back to a process to be able to, or revert back to a point before you started breaking things, to always have that working model to pull from. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense for those that are on kind of all different scales.
Sure. So it sounds like, generally, of course, you're doing the work in a staging environment. Sounded like you're maybe using different models depending maybe even on the clients you're supporting. I don't know, just how your techniques have evolved over time. But it sounded like the first recommendation you made was, to look on your hosts to see if they support some sort of staging environment or cloning for the purpose of staging. Is that accurate, like on your first kind of recommendation there?
Yeah, that's perfect. It's one of those that work with a hosting provider to have the staging environment. So, or I was actually, when I was just speaking, blanking on it, but I've used things like MAMP on Macs. You can use for the setup environment. There's things like local that you can use. Basically, something that you can set up a test server or environment for a specific project. But the key that I find that helps me the most is the ability to revert back to a specific snapshot.
Yeah,
that way. Yeah.
Good.
No, that's perfect. To go from there.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, because simply having a staging environment that you can't roll back to a prior instance means you're going to have some extra steps there to get it to roll back, if you will, depending on the system that you're using. I'm glad you mentioned local. That's a tool by WP Engine, the company I work for. I love it. It's free. That's actually my go-to for local WordPress development. I've not tried MAMP. Is that what it's called? I always forget how it's pronounced.
Yeah, it's MAMP. I call it MAMP, MAMP.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's basically, it's a I it's a non-Docker kind of environment that another software development group created that's Mac OS specific, and I think they do have a Windows version now, but it before, and I just started using local within the last year or so, because it was one of those things that I just you get your normal tool set and you work with it forever until you find something different, and then you adapt to that. And so MAMP remind me of, or there's a lot of features that local does that's more simplified, because that's the key point I want to come back to, is you have to have something that's simple to revert back to something, because if it takes even 10 minutes to revert back to a certain point, that can affect your development cycle in a way that makes it where your willingness to experiment is hindered, because that's really what you need to be able to do, is try, break, test, fix, and then analyze, did it achieve the end result, and then repeat on the next item. Hopefully that makes sense.
I think that's a fantastic consideration. I haven't heard very many people actually mention that, any consideration around your local or staging environments, but it makes all the sense in the world. Love it. And so I can even imagine the things I do to make it easy to revert changes for the same reason. So definitely hits home for me. Earlier, we talked about, what you thought about breaking your site, and a little bit around, what you might want to break, but how do you think about what to break?
I think about breaking the options table every day of my life.
Okay. Talk me through that.
Well, here's the thing. WordPress is a framework. It's awesome. And it has its flaws. Great. One of the reasons a client hires us is to develop a site or to make their site better. Most likely that client has had multiple different individuals, multiple different plugins, multiple whatever, you can put whatever there, work with that site. However, a lot of developers, a lot of users, and just plain everybody misses the point, or just doesn't think about, how does your MySQL instance look? How does WordPress function overall due to all these different plugins being installed and uninstalled? What do you need to autoload? What not? And that really leads me into the point of an options table can be your worst nightmare and it can be your hero, all in the same breath.
So the options table is specifically one of the key areas you look at breaking. Are there any particular optimizations to the options table that are consistent points for you of optimization, like things that just pop up all the time?
A lot of it points to making sure to clear out plugins that are not utilized, as far as what the leftovers are. Your chances are your WordPress instance overall has a lot of leftovers, and a lot of the quote unquote cleaning plugins can only do what they can properly categorize. So if you have a site that's been highly customized over the year or had modifications, chances are that from the database optimization side, it's a mess. And so when you're working with the options table, you can actually find out what is a mess and what's not by enabling or re-enabling things, and being willing to break it to find out what is truly needed is what I think of breaking the WordPress site, because in that you can find a lot of bloat and a lot of things that can be removed or done differently to make sure that the user experience is great, that the site is achieving its objectives, and that at the end of the day, you don't have a chaotic mess that nobody can pick up and continue to build on from whatever stage that site is forward.
Okay, so that makes sense. And, like listening to you talk through those specific points, I think the thing that leaps out to me is kind of a consistent truth working with engineers over the years. And that's everybody wants to remove the code bloat, simplify, and refactor the software. You know what I mean? Like every time someone picks up a project, they're thinking like, okay, I need to make this better. I need to make it more efficient. This was done inefficiently. And there's like this great, even to your own code, this great attraction to go back and refactor. And so you start to think like, well, is it worth my time? Does it work well, even though it's messy? Does it achieve the outcome, even though it's messy? And is it worth investing to do it a better way? And I think like philosophically, we know it's better, but like, is it worth the trade-off? And so I really want to understand how you start to measure the trade-off and the time you're investing to break and rebuild things. But we're going to cover that when we're back after this last break.
Time to plug into a commercial break. Stay tuned for more Press This in just a moment.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Press This, the WordPress Community Podcast on WMR. This is your host, David Vogelpohl. We're breaking websites to make them better with Jacob Warr. Jacob, right before the break, you were talking a lot about the opportunities for optimization and breaking things and making them better, particularly around the options table. And then you kind of had gotten into identifying, remnants of the past and bloat that might be getting in the way of performance or other aspects of the site that you could clean up. And I'm just curious, I kind of hinted at this before the break, is like, it takes time and energy to do these things. When you're breaking and rebuilding, how do you know that was the right decision in the end?
How did it affect the user experience? That's the key. Do you have, because just cleaning up code or anything like that, it's only worth the time if it's bringing value. And as a company that's focused on providing value to an end client, it doesn't help them achieve what they're trying to do. They're trying to get users to interact with the content on the site and to work with it. So there becomes a balance that you have to identify for a project of, okay, am I doing this just to make it work better because I know it would work better? Or is there real world indications that this is improving the user experience in a way that the users are actually using the site? That's the core direction that I highly recommend focusing on first and foremost.
Do you feel that generally sometimes always aligns with the business objective of the site? Obviously I'm just curious your thoughts on like the notion of measurement and quote, was it worth it by the business objective of the site? In other words, do sales have to go up, or is the customer experience or the user experience good enough, as you will, for optimizing?
This is where it gets into something that is, I think, missed quite a bit. It's not only on sales going up after the change, it's retention of the customers and how the sales is actually happening for the clients. There's a lot of times there's a disconnect between sales departments and development. And that's something that needs to, especially in an environment that's always changing, meaning the marketplace, the digital marketplace overall. Now, there needs to be more of a synergy of that. Is the client satisfaction from the interaction to the website to achieve a purchase? Is it something that the end client / user enjoys? Are they quickly buying? What is the variables there that's preventing them from not purchasing the service or product that they're doing for whatever site? because just changing and optimizing your code or anything like that, if it's not a good product that's even being sold, you're going to have a variable there that's not going to be a good indicator. And so it's really important to focus on, from the user experience, are they enjoying themselves, essentially?
It's really interesting thinking back to my agency days and, building sites for new companies or, new offerings, if you will, and feeling like the user experience was great, but, the sales in some cases might not have been what everyone expected. And so you start to think about the role of the web design versus the role of the product and its purchasability, if you will. And it is an interesting tug and pull because it's difficult to unwind the root cause of both. But the product you sell and the way you describe it, of course, are critical parts. And I think are obviously part of the site you're building if you're an engineer, but not necessarily your direct area of concern. But yeah, it's an interesting tug and pull. I know that's what we weren't talking today in terms of breaking it, but I think it's helpful to understand measurement, because I know it can get frustrating for software teams when things don't result in financial outcomes, but you think what you did was good, and having a language and measurement system to maybe show that it actually was for some reason.
And if you don't mind me jumping in there, David.
Yeah, go ahead.
There is a key component there that, looking at it from the back end and the front end, you have to make sure that there is constant communication there. You can only optimize so far. You can have the fastest engine in the world, but if it's in a bus, it's not going to perform as if it was in something that was the size of a Geo Metro type of deal. And so if it doesn't matter how fast you get there, if nobody wants to get there in the first place. And that leads into a whole bunch of other conversations now on the content side, which we definitely don't have enough time even today to cover all that.
Well, I think this has been great, Jacob. I think you've given people lots of ideas to noodle on when breaking their sites and the tug and pull of the different concerns when doing so. So I thought this was awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jacob.
Yeah, David, thank you so much for having me. And yeah, it's one of those that the core thing to wrap up all this whole experience, and again, thank you, is just be willing to break your site. Be willing to dive into the nuts and bolts and be okay with learning to fix it. And I mean that from both, not so much on the client side, when you're rendering client services, but in your test environments, and take a site, rip it apart, learn. Don't be scared of it. That's what I would kind of summarize everything with.
I love it. I love it. If you'd like to learn more about what Jacob is up to, you can visit warrenresearchinc.com. Thanks everyone for listening to Press This, the WordPress Community Podcast on WMR. Again, this has been your host, David Vogelpohl. I support the WordPress community through my role at WP Engine, and I love to bring the best of the community to you here every week on Press This.
The opinions expressed on this program are those of the guests and hosts and do not necessarily reflect those of WebmasterRadio.fm's management or sponsors. Any rebroadcast or redistribution without authorized consent of WebmasterRadio.fm is prohibited.